0445, September 15, 1944, Peleliu, Palau Islands. The pre-dawn darkness over the Pacific is absolute, a velvet blanket smothering the sea. The air is thick, humid, and still. It carries the smell of salt, damp earth, and a faint, acrid hint of explosives from the previous day's bombardment. Along the shoreline known as White Beach, the gentle lap of waves is disrupted, not by nature but by the low, metallic clatter of amphibious tractors, LVTs, forming up into lines. Inside them, men of the 1st Marine Division sit in silent tension. They check their rifles for the 10th time. They touch the letters in their pockets. A few hundred yards inland, the island is not silent. It is a crouched, listening beast. From a low, jagged ridge of ancient coral limestone, no muzzle flashes give away positions, no silhouettes move against the sky. The ridge is a pale, dead thing in the gloom, but within it, a network of caves and tunnels, carved and reinforced over months, houses the defenders of the Japanese 14th Infantry Division. They have endured 30 hours of naval gunfire. They are waiting. Their orders are not to stop the Americans at the water's edge, but to bleed them white, yard by yard, from positions American shells cannot reach. As the first gray light bleeds into the sky, the roar of U.S. Navy guns resumes. The world erupts in sound and fire. The ridge disappears behind a curtain of smoke and debris, but when the barrage lifts, shifting inland, the ridge remains, silent, unchanged. The Marines storm ashore. The initial resistance is sporadic. Then, as they press forward into the scrubland before the ridge, the beast awakens. Machine gun and mortar fire, crisscrossing from invisible apertures, pins them down. Every attempt to advance is met with lethal, entrenched fire. The battle bogs down into a brutal, costly stalemate under the rising sun. Then a new sound cuts through the din of rifle fire and explosions. It is a deep, guttural whoosh, like a giant striking a match. A torrent of liquid fire, thick and orange, arcs from a Marine's position towards a hidden cave mouth. It splashes against the rock, clinging and burning with a ferocious chemical heat. For a moment, the relentless chatter of a Japanese Nambu machine gun is replaced by a different, more terrible sound. The duel between an ancient spirit and a modern horror has begun. To understand the confrontation on that Peleliu ridge, one must first step back to the broader canvas of the Pacific War. By mid-1943, the strategic initiative had irrevocably shifted. The victories at Midway and Guadalcanal had blunted Japan's offensive spear. The Allied response, masterminded by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur, was the island-hopping campaign. Its logic was surgical: bypass heavily fortified Japanese strongholds, seize key islands with airfield potential, and strangle the enemy's supply lines, leaving isolated garrisons to wither. The objective was not the capture of every island, but the creation of a runway chain that would bring the Japanese home islands within range of American heavy bombers. This new American strategy presented Imperial Japan with an existential tactical dilemma: the doctrine that had won them their early victories, the aggressive, offensive spirit, the decisive battle fought at sea or on welcoming shores, was now obsolete. They could not match the industrial output of the United States in ships or planes. They could not defend every island in their vast oceanic perimeter. A new form of defense was required, one that would make the American advance so costly in blood and time that the United States would seek a negotiated peace rather than total victory. The answer was born in the jungles of New Guinea and the atolls of the Central Pacific. It was a doctrine of attrition, depth, and psychological warfare. The Japanese High Command, studying the bloody American landings at Tarawa in November 1943, made a critical decision: the old tactic of defending at the beach, of meeting the invader at the water's edge and hurling him back, was too vulnerable to pre-invasion naval and aerial bombardment. Instead, they would invite the enemy ashore. This was the genesis of the Fakaku defense, the honeycomb or fortress concept. Its Architect was, in many ways, the collective experience of defeat, officers like Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a ruthless and influential strategist, advocated for a radical shift. Defenses would be dug deep inland, on the high ground overlooking landing beaches. They would consist of extensive, interconnected tunnel systems, bunkers carved into coral and rock, and fortified reverse slope positions immune to direct naval fire. The goal was no longer to prevent a landing, but to protract the battle indefinitely. Every hill, every cave, every gully would become a strongpoint to be eliminated at a terrible price. The battle would devolve into a war of moles, a slow, grinding, and savage struggle for individual holes in the ground. 2 islands were selected to be the ultimate test of this doctrine, the linchpins of Japan's inner defense ring. The first, Iwo Jima, a barren volcanic speck halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo, was crucial for its early warning radar and fighter interceptor base, which threatened American B-29s. The second, Okinawa, a large island Ryukyu chain, was the final stepping stone to Japan itself, capable of hosting the massive air and ground forces needed for invasion. The fortification of these islands became a national obsession. To Iwo Jima, commanded by the innovative and formidable General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, went thousands of tons of cement, steel reinforcing rods, and skilled engineers. They transformed the island's soft volcanic rock into a multi-storied subterranean city, with miles of tunnels, hundreds of hidden artillery positions, and command posts buried deep under Mount Suribachi and the northern plateau. Okinawa, under General Mitsuru Ushijima, saw a similar transformation of the ancient coral ridges around Shuri Castle into a dense, mutually supporting network of fortifications known as the Shuri Line. But concrete and tunnels were only the skeleton of the defense. Its soul, the force meant to animate these static positions and inflict unacceptable casualties, was not merely military, it was cultural, spiritual, and absolute. It was the code of the samurai, revived for a modern, total war. The spiritual engine of the Fakaku defense was an ideology, both ancient and freshly codified. Bushido, the way of the warrior. For centuries, it was an unwritten ethical system for the samurai class, emphasizing honor, martial mastery, loyalty, and above all, a stoic acceptance of death. In the early 20th century, this code was extracted from history, simplified, and weaponized by the Japanese state. It was distilled into a potent national ethos, taught in schools and drilled into every soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. For the conscript from a Tokyo alley or the farmer from Kyushu, Bushido was no longer a complex philosophy. It was a clear, brutal directive. To die for the emperor was the highest glory. Surrender was the ultimate, unforgivable disgrace, contaminating one's family for generations. This indoctrination was reinforced by institutionalized brutality within the military itself. The 1882 Imperial Rescript to soldiers and sailors demanded absolute loyalty, framing the relationship between the soldier and the emperor as that of a child to a divine parent. Discipline was maintained through relentless physical punishment, designed to break the individual will and rebuild it as part of the collective. The result was a fighting force capable of astonishing endurance, ferocity, and fatalism. On the tactical level, this ethos manifested in the concept of Jyokusai, shattered jewel. It was more poetic than annihilation, but its meaning was identical, a fight to the last man. A unit was to be destroyed completely, like a beautiful jewel shattered. Rather than allow itself to be captured or to retreat, this was not a metaphor for desperate last stands. It was standard operational doctrine, on Atu in the Aleutians in 1943, on Tarawa, and most horrifically on Saipan in June 1944, Japanese garrisons and even civilian populations demonstrated Jyokusai. On Saipan, after a final suicidal banzai charge failed, thousands of soldiers and civilians, believing American capture meant torture and death, leaped from the cliffs at Marpy Point. The message to American planners was chilling. an enemy that would not surrender could only be exterminated. This combination, the Fukaku physical defense and the Bushido psychological defense, created a tactical problem of unprecedented horror for the American forces. Advancing across the Pacific, naval bombardment, however massive, could not destroy what it could not see. Airstrikes could crater the landscape but leave tunnels intact. Infantry assaults on prepared positions were met with interlocking fields of fire from invisible sources. The defender had no logistical tail to cut, no rear area to threaten. He was embedded in the terrain itself, with stockpiles of food, water, and ammunition to last for months. He was ordered to stay in his hole, to kill as many Americans as possible, and to die there. The traditional tools of war were failing. Artillery could suppress but not eliminate. Grenades could clear a room, but not a tunnel network that stretched for dozens of yards. The rifle and bayonet were useless against a machine gun nest sighted through a narrow slit 5 inches wide. American Marines and soldiers found themselves pinned down, bleeding for every foot of ground, against an enemy they often only saw in death. The casualty projections for the planned invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were apocalyptic. A new tool was needed, not a tool of explosive force but of intimate, terrifying consumption. The war in the Pacific demanded a weapon that could reach deep into the earth, that could turn the defender's greatest strength, his fortified hidden position, into a tomb. It demanded a weapon that could test not just the physical defenses of the Fukaku system, but the very spiritual resolve of the Bushido warrior. The answer had been in development for years, waiting for its moment. It was a weapon as old as warfare itself, now rendered portable, industrial, and horrifyingly efficient. It was fire. This sets the stage for our exploration of the multiple angles of this confrontation. Shall I proceed to the first section of angles, beginning with the human fortress, the Japanese soldier transformed into a component of the terrain? The Japanese infantryman who inhabited the Fukaku defenses was a unique product of his nation's total war. He was not merely a soldier in a trench, he was a component engineered for a specific, lethal function. His training began with the systematic dismantling of his civilian identity. Through brutal discipline, sleep deprivation, and relentless physical conditioning, his individual will was suppressed. In its place was instilled the Kodomo no Kokoro, the heart of a child towards superiors, and the Furyu no Kokoro, the heart of a windstorm towards the enemy. He learned to endure suffering as a virtue, and to see his own life as inherently less valuable than his duty. On the defense, this soldier achieved a symbiotic relationship with his terrain. In the stifling heat of Peleliu's limestone caves or the sulfurous darkness of Iwo Jima's tunnels, he existed for weeks or months. His world shrank to the few yards of his bunker or firing port. He knew the angle of the morning sun through his aperture, the pattern of shadows that signaled an approach. His supplies, rice, pickled plums, tinned fish, and water, were meticulously rationed. Sanitation was a bucket in a side chamber. The air was thick with the smells of unwashed men, damp earth, cordite, and human waste. He lived in a state of perpetual readiness, sleeping in shifts, his weapon always at hand. He was not defending a position, he was the position. His consciousness merged with the machine gun he crewed, the mortar he served. His death, when it came, was not a retreat but the final activation of the fortress's purpose, to make the enemy pay. For the attacking American Marine or soldier, the Fukaku defense presented a nightmarish puzzle. The initial landing might be deceptively easy. The Japanese were letting them ashore, but as they moved inland, the island itself seemed to erupt. Fire came from everywhere and nowhere. A platoon would be pinned down by a single expertly camouflaged machine gun nest. Standard assault procedures would fail. Charge would be cut down. Flanking maneuvers would stumble into another, unseen position. Calling in artillery or naval gunfire on a single, small target was often ineffective and slow. The core of the problem was the cave, a natural or excavated hole in rock could withstand anything but a direct hit from the largest ordnance. Its entrance could be a narrow slit angled to deflect shells and bullets. Inside, it zigzagged to prevent explosions from penetrating deep. It had multiple firing ports and escape hatches. It was connected by tunnels to other caves, allowing defenders to reinforce, resupply, or retreat to fight another day. Grenades thrown inside would be ineffective beyond the first bend. Sending men in with rifles and bayonets was a near-suicidal proposition. The first man through the entrance was a guaranteed casualty. The battles of 1943 and early 1944 were laboratories of bloody trial and error. On Tarawa, Marines used explosive charges and gasoline poured into bunkers, ignited with grenades, a crude precursor. On Bayek and Guam, they developed rudimentary blowtorch and corkscrew tactics, using tanks or direct artillery fire, the blowtorch, to suppress, followed by infantry assaults to seal the hole, the corkscrew. But the process was agonizingly slow and costly. The U.S. military needed a dedicated, standardized, and terrifyingly efficient tool for cave and bunker neutralization. The war's tempo demanded a weapon that could keep pace with the grim arithmetic of attrition. The weapon's lineage was ancient, but its modern incarnation was a product of World War I trench warfare. By WWAI, the United States had developed the M1 and later the improved M1A1 portable flamethrower. It was a deceptively simple, brutally effective system. On the operator's back were two connected tanks, one holding 4-5 gallons of thickened fuel napalm, a naphthalene and palm oil gel that stuck to surfaces and burned longer, the other compressed nitrogen gas. A hose led to a gun-like wand with an ignition system. Squeezing the trigger released the pressurized fuel, which passed over an igniter at the nozzle, projecting a stream of liquid fire up to 40 yards, though effective combat range was half that. It was a weapon of profound psychological and physical impact, but it came with severe liabilities. The operator or flamethrower man was instantly the most visible and hated target on the battlefield. His equipment weighed over 70 pounds, making him slow and cumbersome. The tanks on his back were vulnerable to bullet penetration. A hit could turn him into a human torch. His fuel supply lasted for only 8-10 seconds of continuous fire, necessitating careful, timed bursts. Because of these vulnerabilities, he never operated alone. He was the centerpiece of a small, specialized team, a rifleman to protect him, often a Browning automatic rifle, gunner for suppressive fire, and a demolitions man with satchel charges and smoke grenades. These teams were frequently drawn from the Chemical Warfare Service in the Army or organized with Marine Corps engineer or pioneer units. They were the specialists called forward when the infantry was stopped cold by concrete and rock. The flamethrower was not just a tool of destruction, it was a tool of applied terror. It solved the tactical problem by bypassing the enemy's physical defenses entirely. It did not need a line of sight to the defender inside his cave. The stream of napalm could be shot around corners, into crevices, down ventilation shafts. It filled confined spaces with instant, oxygen-consuming fire and toxic fumes. It turned the defender's sanctuary into an oven. This technological answer, however, created new dimensions of human experience and horror, both for those who used it and those who faced it. For the Japanese soldier, the flamethrower represented the ultimate negation of his chosen form of battle. Bushido glorified a clear martial contest. Death from a rifle bullet or bayonet wound could be framed as a warrior's end. Death by fire was something else entirely. It was ancient, horrific, and deeply unsettling to a culture that practiced ritual cremation as a sacred rite. The weapon attacked not just the body, but the very concept of an honorable death. Tactically, the flamethrower bypassed every advantage of the Fakaku defense. The deep cave became a death trap. The interconnected tunnels acted as chimneys, spreading the fire and suffocating smoke. The carefully constructed firing ports became inlets for Torrent of flame, there were few effective countermeasures. Shooting the operator was the primary goal, and Japanese snipers and machine gunners were specifically instructed to target the distinctive silhouette of the flamethrower man first, some desperate. Defenders would rush the nozzle in banzai charges, hoping to detonate the tanks before the trigger was squeezed. Others attempted to use blankets or mats soaked in water to shield themselves, a pitifully inadequate defense against clinging napalm. The psychological impact was profound and documented in diaries and last messages. Soldiers wrote of the liquid fire that flowed like water, filling their positions with an inescapable, consuming heat, the fear of being burned alive, of a death that was not instant but agonizing and disfiguring, pierced the armor of fatalistic resolve. While many still fought to the end, there are instances, particularly in the final days on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, where the approach of the flamethrower prompted surrenders. A previously unthinkable act, the flamethrower, more than any other weapon, demonstrated that American technological ingenuity could find a way to break the spiritual fortitude the Japanese high command relied upon as its ultimate strategic reserve. The man who carried the flamethrower bore a unique and crushing weight, both physical and psychological. In the infantry, he was viewed with a mixture of awe, pity, and superstition. His life expectancy in a protracted assault was measured in minutes. He knew he was the primary target, moving forward under fire with the heavy, cumbersome pack made him agonizingly slow. The hiss of the ignition and the roar of the flame announced his presence to every enemy within 100 yards. His job was one of intimate horror. He was not firing at a distant target or a silhouette figure. He was called forward to exterminate. After his team suppressed a position, he would advance to point-blank range. He would aim the nozzle at a dark hole in the earth, a slit in a concrete pillbox. He would squeeze the trigger. He would not see the enemy inside. He would hear them. The sounds that emerged from a struck position were seared into the memories of every flamethrower operator. Screams, the roar of the fire itself, and sometimes the terrifying pop of cooking ammunition, the smell of burning fuel, of charred rock, and of something else would cling to him. After the war, many of these men struggled profoundly. They were not just soldiers. They had been the instruments of one of war's most feared elements. Their weapon left no wounded, only the dead and the utterly consumed. They carried the knowledge that their essential, life-saving function for their own comrades was, from another perspective, an act of grotesque terror. They were heroes to the Marines whose lives they saved by clearing a deadly blockhouse, yet they often felt isolated, their specific war experience too dark to share. The flamethrower existed in a stark moral landscape from the American command perspective. It was a weapon of grim necessity, a tool that saved countless American lives by shortening battles and breaking impregnable defenses. The calculus was cold and clear. The use of a horrifying weapon against a fortified position could spare the lives of an entire platoon that would otherwise be lost in a frontal assault. It was a logical response to an enemy who had removed all rules of surrender and embedded himself within the earth. Yet its very effectiveness stemmed from its capacity to inspire primal terror. It was weaponized fire, mankind's oldest and most feared element, now directed with precision. It killed through immolation and asphyxiation, methods that international conventions of the time and human conscience viewed with particular revulsion. The Japanese propaganda machine seized upon it as a symbol of American barbarity, a sign that they were fighting a ruthless and inhuman enemy. This created a chasm in perception. For the U.S. military, it was a technical solution to a tactical problem. For the Japanese soldier, it was the ultimate proof of a war without honor. For the operator, it was a burden of horrific efficacy. The flamethrower thus sits at the uncomfortable intersection of military pragmatism and the boundaries of acceptable horror in warfare. It was born from the specific, brutal conditions of the Pacific theater, where one side's refusal to surrender morally permitted in the view of the other. The use of any weapon that would end the fighting. This collision of spirit, tactics, technology, and morality would reach its fiery climax on two islands whose names would become synonyms for sacrifice, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Operation Detachment began on the morning of February 19, 1945, as the first waves of Marines landed on the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima. They encountered the perfected form of the Fukaku defense. General Tadamichi Kurabayashi had forbidden wasteful banzai charges and surface defenses. His 21,000 men were invisible, buried deep within the island's soft rock. The initial naval bombardment, one of the largest of the Pacific. War had moved geological matter but had scarcely touched the garrison. The Marines advanced inland and the island awoke. The first days were a bloodbath of attrition, from Mount Suribachi in the south to the complex network of ridges, gorges, and bunkers in the north, dubbed the Meat Grinder, the Amphitheater, and Turkey Knob. The Japanese fought from spider holes, pillboxes, and multi-leveled caves. Standard infantry tactics faltered. A company would spend a day and suffer 50% casualties to advance 200 yards. It was a war of yards, of individual holes. It was here that the flamethrower evolved from a supporting tool to the primary instrument of advance. The U.S. Marine Corps, learning from Peleliu, had integrated flamethrower teams at the lowest levels. Sherman tanks were fitted with bow-mounted flamethrowers, the Ronson system, becoming mobile fortresses that could hose down ridges and bunker apertures, but it was the infantry-operated M1A1 that became the tip of the spear. The procedure became a grim, perfected ballet. When a fortified position was identified, supporting arms would lay down suppressive fire. Riflemen and bar gunners would pin down any adjacent apertures. Under this cover, the flamethrower team would crawl forward, often under direct sniper fire. The demolitions man might first toss in a smoke grenade to obscure the cave mouth. Then, the flamethrower operator would rise to a crouch approach at an angle and shoot a 1 or 2 second burst of napalm into the opening. The goal was not necessarily to incinerate the occupants instantly, but to fill the space with fire and superheated, oxygen-deprived air. The team would then rush forward. The demolitions man would follow up with a satchel charge, tossed deep into the cavity to collapse the interior and seal it as a tomb. They would then immediately shift to the next aperture, the next cave mouth. On Iwo Jima, the psychological effect of the flamethrower became a tangible combat multiplier. Marines reported Japanese soldiers who had endured days of shelling without flinching, breaking from their positions in terror at the sight of the nozzle, only to be cut down by rifle fire. The battles for key strongpoints were decided by flame at Hill 362, a complex that had repulsed multiple battalions. The systematic use of flamethrowers and demolitions over 72 hours finally silenced the position. The fight for Kurabayashi's final command center involved pouring thousands of gallons of gasoline into the cave network and igniting it with thermite grenades, a flamethrower tactic on a colossal scale. By the time the island was declared secure on March 26, the flamethrower had proven its brutal worth. It had been the key to unlocking a defense that conventional weapons could not crack. But Iwo Jima was only a prelude, a 8-square-mile test of the doctrine. The next island would be larger, the defenses more sophisticated, and the stakes infinitely higher. The flamethrower's ultimate trial awaited on the ridges of Okinawa. The battle for Iwo Jima proved the flamethrower could conquer a deep defense on a small island, but could it prevail in a prolonged campaign against a vast, interconnected defensive line manned by an army? The answer would define the final act of the Pacific War. Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, began on April 1, 1945. For the first few days, it seemed a phantom operation. The landings were virtually unopposed, but it was the same deadly invitation extended on Peleliu and Iwo Jima, now on a monumental scale. The Japanese 32nd Army, under General Mitsuru Ushijima had withdrawn to the ancient coral ridges of the Shuri Line in southern Okinawa. This was not a series of isolated strongpoints, but a contiguous, mutually supporting network of fortifications spanning the island's waist. It was the Fukaku defense evolved into a geographically vast, deeply integrated organism. When the U.S. 10th Army, comprised of both Army and Marine divisions, finally made contact with the Shuri Line in early April, they met a wall of fire. Positions like Kakazu Ridge, the Mito Escarpment, and Shuri Castle itself were natural fortresses, honeycombed with tunnels, artillery positions, and machine gun nests. Conventional assaults shattered against them. The Battle of Okinawa threatened to become a protracted siege of unimaginable cost. In this grueling campaign, the flamethrower transitioned from a specialist's tool to an indispensable, ubiquitous weapon of the infantry. Its use became systematic, industrial, and utterly central to daily combat. Tank-mounted flamethrowers, now including models like the PUACWS Pacific Ocean Area Chemical Warfare Service, H-1, which could project flame over 150 yards, became armored pillars of the advance, scouring reverse slopes and valley approaches. But again, it was the backpack infantry teams who performed the most intimate and dangerous work. The tactical process was refined to a grim science, a typical reduction of a Shuri line. Position might unfold over hours or days. First, artillery and mortars would plaster the area to suppress the defenders. Tanks and self-propelled howitzers would then move forward to engage specific apertures with direct fire, their shells blasting away camouflage and enlarging openings. Under this cover, infantry squads would maneuver as close as possible, using grenades and rifle fire to keep the defenders' heads down. Then the flamethrower team would make its move. The operator, his heavy pack, making him a slow and obvious target, would dash from cover to cover, following a path laid down by his covering teams, suppressing fire. At the base of the ridge or the mouth of a cave, he would brace. A short, precise burst of napalm would lance into the opening. The effect was often immediately apparent. Screams, the frantic discharge of weapons from within, or figures staggering out, clothes and skin alight, to be cut down by waiting riflemen. Following the flame, demolitionists would advance with satchel charges and pole charges, explosives on long bamboo poles, to physically collapse the cave or bunker interior. Engineers with bulldozers would then often seal the ruins permanently. The weather turned the battlefield into a muddy hell in May, slowing all movement but making the flamethrowers' searing heat all the more psychologically potent against shivering, waterlogged defenders. The fight for Shuri Castle itself, a medieval fortress sitting atop a maze of modern concrete command posts and gun emplacements, was a microcosm of the entire campaign, a brutal, yard-by-yard struggle won with flame, explosives, and the sheer endurance of the American infantry. By late June, as organized resistance collapsed, the flamethrower had become the symbol of the close-quarters fight on Okinawa. It had been used to clear thousands of positions, from simple spider holes to vast, multi-room underground barracks and hospitals. It had broken the backbone of the Shuri line. In doing so, it had also presented U.S. commanders with irrefutable, if ghastly, data on its effectiveness. Weapon that could force a Bushido-inspired defender from his deep fortress had proven itself not merely useful, but decisive. The lessons of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were crystal clear for the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall. Flamethrower would not be an accessory, it would be a fundamental requirement, manufactured and deployed in quantities that dwarfed anything yet seen. The fiery climax of Okinawa was not just the end of a battle, it was a portent of a future invasion, a future where entire landscapes might be subjected to the same intimate, consuming horror. The aftermath of this brutal efficiency would be measured in statistics, in shattered minds, and in the enduring legacy of a weapon that defined the limits of desperation in modern war. The brutal arithmetic of the Pacific War's final campaigns delivered a stark, unambiguous verdict on the flamethrower. On a tactical level, it was deemed an overwhelming success, a weapon that saved American lives by the thousands. The U.S. military's own after-action reports and analyses were clear. Against deep, complex fortifications, the flamethrower reduced infantry casualties by 80–90% compared to conventional assault methods, where a platoon might be decimated trying to storm a bunker with rifles and grenades. A single flamethrower team, supported by a squad, could neutralize the same position with a far lower risk of loss. Commanders viewed it not as a weapon of terror, but as a tool of forced entry efficiency, the only logical counter to an enemy's refusal to fight in the open. The human cost it exacted, however, was recorded in two parallel ledgers. The first is the statistical horror of the Japanese losses. On Iwo Jima, of the approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner, many too badly wounded to resist. The vast majority of the rest were killed in their fortifications, with flamethrowers and satchel charges being the leading cause. On Okinawa, the scale was even greater. Over 110,000 Japanese military personnel died, along with tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians, while artillery, naval gunfire, and disease claimed many. The close quarter reduction of the Shiri line was accomplished primarily by flamethrowers and demolitions. The weapon had achieved its grim purpose, the near-total physical extermination of the entrenched enemy. The second ledger records the cost borne by the victors. U.S. casualties were grievous. Nearly 7,000 killed on Iwo Jima, over 12,500 killed on Okinawa, with total casualties exceeding 80,000. The flamethrower operators suffered disproportionately high rates of death and injury. Their life expectancy in a sustained assault was measured in mere combat days, but beyond the physical toll was a profound psychological burden. The men who wielded the flamethrower and the riflemen who guarded them were exposed to sights and sounds that marked them permanently. They were not engaging an abstract enemy at distance. They were, in the most visceral way possible, cleansing positions, the memories of specific engagements, the sounds from a cave post ignition, the smell that hung in the air, the appearance of the remains, haunted countless veterans in silence. For many, their essential, life-saving role was inextricably tangled with a deep, unspoken trauma. They had wielded a weapon whose use, even necessity, felt transgressive. This dichotomy defined the flamethrower's legacy, a tool of salvation for the broader force and an instrument of intimate horror for those at the sharpest end of its use. Its effectiveness was so proven that it immediately shaped the next, and most ominous, phase of Allied planning. The lessons of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were not historical footnotes. They were the blueprint for an impending, and even more terrible, confrontation. The weapon had won its battles. Now, it would define the preparations for a final cataclysm. The demonstrated effectiveness of the flamethrower against the Fukaku doctrine had one immediate and terrifying strategic consequence. It became a cornerstone of the planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall. Military planners studying the casualty ratios from Iwo Jima and Okinawa projected losses in the hundreds of thousands for the assault on the southern island of Kyushu, Operation Olympic, and the Kanto Plain near Tokyo, Operation Coronet. The Japanese home islands were known to be fortified even more extensively than Okinawa, with a mobilized civilian population expected to fight with fanatical resistance. In response, the U.S. initiated an unprecedented industrial and tactical mobilization. Centered on the flamethrower, procurement orders were placed for tens of thousands of new M2 flamethrower units, an improved model with better range and reliability. Training programs were massively expanded. The entire invasion force, from Marine divisions to Army infantry, was to be saturated with flamethrower teams. Furthermore, the concept of the flamethrower was scaled up dramatically. Plans were drawn for flame tanks in far greater numbers, and even for the use of armored flamethrower. Vehicles to clear beach obstacles and fortified seawalls, the Chemical Warfare Service. Studied the area saturation use of fire from modified landing craft and aircraft. The war in the Pacific was poised to culminate in a conflagration of unimaginable scale, where fire would be the primary language of assault against an entire nation welded into a collective fortress. The atomic bombs of August 1945 rendered this fiery apocalypse unnecessary, but the detailed plans for it stand as a chilling testament to the flamethrowers' ratified status as the definitive weapon for the job. In the post-war world, the flamethrowers' utility swiftly declined. The conditions that bred it masked static, deeply entrenched defenses manned by an ideologically committed enemy largely vanished from conventional warfare. It saw limited use in Korea, notably against Chinese hilltop bunkers, and again in Vietnam for clearing tunnel complexes, but its vulnerability to modern infantry weapons, its short range, and the growing weight of ethical scrutiny gradually pushed it to the margins. That ethical scrutiny would eventually lead to its retirement. The 1977 Protocol III of the Geneva Convention on Prohibitions or Restrictions on the Use of Incendiary Weapons specifically restricted the use of flame weapons against civilians and notably against military targets located within concentrations of civilians, while it did not ban flamethrowers outright. The protocol reflected a global consensus on the weapon's uniquely horrific nature. The United States, the weapon's most prolific developer and user in WWII, finally retired its last portable flamethrower systems in 1978. The tank-mounted systems followed later. The weapon was phased out not because it was ineffective, but because the world had judged its effects, born of the Pacific's unique held to be beyond the pale of modern conflict. Thus, the flamethrower's legacy is one of paradoxical extremes. It was a weapon of profound military effectiveness born of absolute military necessity. It saved untold numbers of American lives while extinguishing Japanese lives in a manner designed to break the human spirit. It became the symbol of the Pacific War's distinctive, close quarters brutality, a brutality born from the intersection of an ancient code of death before surrender and the modern industrial capacity to deliver a horrific, intimate form of it. It stands as a dark technological monument to a specific and terrible moment in history when the only answer to a fortress of body and spirit was liquid fire. The story of the flamethrower in the Pacific is not merely a tale of technological adaptation. It is a grim parable about the logical endpoints of total war. It reveals how tactics and weapons evolve in direct, brutal conversation with the enemy's will. The U.S. flamethrower was the engineered solution to a problem the Japanese military state had deliberately created, a defense that leveraged terrain, psychology, and a cult of death to make victory so costly it would be unpalatable. In response, American industry and ingenuity produced a weapon that turned those very advantages into traps. The deep cave became an oven. The refusal to surrender made extermination the only military option. The flamethrower did not test Bushido's spirit in the abstract. It presented its practitioner with an impossible choice: break your code and emerge, or honor it and be consumed. In doing so, it laid bare a terrible truth that no spiritual fortitude, however fervent, is immaterial. It exists in a body that is vulnerable to fire. Ultimately, this weapon, born of a specific and desperate need, transcends its mechanics. It becomes a symbol of the Pacific War's unique character, a war of distance, closed, of cultures clashing in profound misunderstanding, fought not over cities and roads but over worthless atolls and rocky ridges, whose only value was the will to hold them. The flamethrower was the final argument in that struggle of wills. It speaks to the moment when warfare, stripped of maneuver and pomp, is reduced to its most primal essence: one man in a hole and another man outside with the means to fill that hole with fire. Its retirement from the arsenals of the world's militaries offers a fragile note of progress. It signifies a collective, if belated, acknowledgement that some weapons, regardless of their tactical utility, carry a moral weight that civilization chooses no longer to bear. Yet, its shadow remains a permanent part of our historical landscape. It stands as a dark testament to the lengths humanity will go to overcome resistance, and a permanent warning of the forms that resistance can take in the silent, charred caves of Peleliu, Iwo. Jima and Okinawa, the echo of that guttural whoosh endures, a reminder of the fiery price paid when ideology and necessity collide in the dark.